The howling wind carried death on its breath that fateful January of 1847. As temperatures plummeted to depths that could freeze a man's blood in his veins, Sarah Collins stood at the doorway of her small homestead, watching the sky darken to a terrifying shade of grey. Her instincts told her this wasn't just another winter storm. This was the kind of blizzard that would later fill graveyards and create legends. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Little did she know that by sunrise, she would be forced to make a choice that would either save 3 innocent lives or condemn them all to an icy grave. The desperate measure she took that night, using the massive carcass of a freshly fallen buffalo as their only shelter, would be whispered about in frontier towns for generations to come. The year was 1847, and the western frontier was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. The Kansas Territory stretched out like an endless sea of rolling hills and flat plains, where tall grasses danced under vast skies and winters could steal the breath from your lungs. For most settlers, survival meant respecting the land's harsh rules and keeping to the safety of established communities. But Sarah Collins had never been one to follow rules set by others. At 32, Sarah operated the only midwifery practice. Within 50 miles, traveling alone between scattered homesteads and small settlements. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and healing had earned her respect, but her independence had earned her suspicion. Unmarried and self-sufficient, she lived in a modest cabin at the edge of Pine Creek, a tiny settlement that consisted of little more than a general store, a blacksmith, and a dozen family homes. "A woman living alone invites trouble," Martha Peterson muttered loudly enough for Sarah to hear as she gathered supplies at Wilson's general store. "It ain't natural, especially not out here." Sarah kept her eyes on the jars of dried herbs she was examining, already accustomed to Martha's disapproval. The woman's husband, Thomas Peterson, was the self-appointed moral compass of Pine Creek, having appointed himself as the settlement's unofficial leader based solely on his ownership of the largest cattle herd. "I imagined trouble would find me." "Regardless, Mrs. Peterson," Sarah replied evenly, offering a practiced smile to Harold Wilson behind the counter. "I'll take these and 2 pounds of coffee, please." Harold nodded, avoiding eye contact as he gathered her items. Sarah understood his position, caught between serving a valued customer and appeasing the influential Petersons. She placed her coins on the counter and gathered her purchases. "The Thompson farm lost another cow to that blizzard last week," Harold mentioned as he wrapped her coffee. "James says it's going to be a brutal winter." Sarah nodded, glancing toward the window where the sky had already begun to darken, though it was barely past noon. "I've been collecting extra firewood. The squirrels have been gathering since August. Never seen them so busy." Martha made a dismissive sound. "If you'd accepted any of the 3 proposals you've had, you'd have a husband to worry about such things." Sarah bit back her response. The last thing she needed was to further antagonize Martha, whose gossip spread through Pine Creek faster than wildfire. Instead, she simply nodded to Harold and stepped toward the door. "Sarah," Harold called hesitantly, "there's word that the Keller family, out past Spirit Ridge, they've taken ill, all of them." Sarah paused, her hand on the door. The Kellers lived nearly 15 miles away, far beyond the usual boundaries most settlers from Pine Creek ventured, especially in winter. "All of them. The children too?" Harold nodded solemnly. "Trapper came through yesterday, said he stopped for water and found them burning with fever. The parents could barely stand." "And no one's gone to help?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. The Kellers were newcomers, having arrived in the spring, and few in Pine Creek had made the effort to welcome them. "In this weather?" Martha scoffed. "Only a fool would risk the journey with this storm brewing." Sarah looked again to the darkening sky. The air had that peculiar stillness that preceded heavy snow, and the clouds hung low and threatening. Every instinct told her to return home, seal her windows with cloth, and keep her fire blazing until the worst passed. But the thought of those children, 3 young ones, if she remembered correctly, suffering without aid, made her stomach twist. "Harold, I'll need candles and extra bandages," she said, turning back to the counter. "And whatever medicines you have in stock." Martha's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. You'll freeze to death before you make it halfway." "Then I'll have died doing something worthwhile," Sarah replied, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "Rather than sitting safely by my fire, knowing children might be dying." The stunned silence that followed gave Sarah a small measure of satisfaction as she gathered additional supplies. She knew what they would say once she left, that Sarah Collins was always a strange one, too headstrong for her own good. They'd shake their heads and predict disaster, and perhaps they were right. But Sarah had not survived this long on the frontier by ignoring her convictions. An hour later, Sarah had loaded her sturdiest horse, a dappled grey mare named Willow, with provisions and medicines. She wore layers of wool and fur, with leather wrappings around her boots and thick mittens,
covering her hands.
The temperature had already dropped considerably, and the first flakes of snow began to fall as she mounted Willow and set off towards Spirit Ridge. The journey started peacefully enough. The early snowfall was light, decorating the prairie in a delicate blanket of white that muffled the sound of Willow's hooves. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, using the distinctive shape of Spirit Ridge as her guide. The massive formation resembled a person lying in repose and had served as a landmark for travelers for generations. By mid-afternoon, the gentle snowfall had transformed into something more sinister. The wind picked up, driving the snow sideways with stinging force. Visibility decreased to mere feet in front of her, and the temperature plummeted further. Sarah pulled her scarf tighter around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed to the biting cold. "Just a little further, girl," she murmured to Willow, who trudged forward with reluctant obedience. "We'll find shelter if it gets worse." But there was no shelter to be found on the open prairie. The blizzard intensified with frightening speed, transforming the landscape into a swirling white void. Sarah could no longer see Spirit Ridge, could barely see beyond Willow's ears. Cold seeped through her layers, and fear began to gnaw at her resolve. Martha's words echoed in her mind. Only a fool would risk the journey. Perhaps she had been foolish after all, driven by pride and stubbornness to prove something that would cost her life. But what choice did she have? The thought of those children burning with fever while their parents lay helpless steeled her determination. The first bullet of pain struck her cheek like an icy needle, followed by another on her forehead. Hail mixed with the snow now, pelting her and Willow mercilessly. The mare whinnied in distress, slowing her pace until she finally stopped altogether, refusing to move against the onslaught. "Please, Willow," Sarah pleaded, her voice lost in the howling wind. "We can't stop here." But neither encouragement nor gentle kicks would convince the horse to continue. With trembling hands, Sarah dismounted, nearly collapsing as her numb legs hit the ground. She would lead Willow on foot, though every step felt like wading through molasses. Time lost meaning in the white oblivion. Sarah wasn't sure if they had been walking for minutes or hours. Her thoughts became sluggish, and a dangerous warmth began to spread through her body, the deceptive comfort that preceded freezing to death. She recognized the symptom with clinical detachment, even as she fought against the urge to simply lie down and rest. The world tilted suddenly, and Sarah found herself on her knees in the snow, unsure how she had fallen. Willow nudged her shoulder, but Sarah couldn't summon the strength to stand. This was it then, The end of Sarah Collins, who had survived scarlet fever at 12, a wild bull attack at 20, and countless frontier hardships since, only to perish in a blizzard because she couldn't ignore the plight of strangers. A dark shape loomed ahead, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, Sarah thought her mind was creating illusions, a common occurrence before death by freezing. But as Willow moved toward it with newfound energy, Sarah forced herself to her feet once more. It was real, something massive and dark against the endless white. As she drew closer, the shape revealed itself. A buffalo, recently fallen, its enormous body half buried in the snow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's mind, though dulled by cold, raced with possibilities. The massive beast must have been separated from its herd and succumbed to the storm, or perhaps been wounded by hunters who couldn't track it in the worsening weather. The buffalo represented shelter, temporary and gruesome, but shelter nonetheless. With the last reserves of her strength, Sarah retrieved her knife from her pack and approached the carcass. The work that followed was brutal and messy, but Sarah's medical experience had long since hardened her against such realities. She cut into the beast's belly, creating an opening large enough for a person to enter. The stench was overwhelming, but the interior was warm, the buffalo's body heat not yet fully dissipated. Sarah led Willow to the lee side of the massive body, where the animal would have some protection from the wind, then crawled inside the carcass herself. The warmth enveloped her immediately, and despite the ghastly nature of her shelter, Sarah felt only gratitude. Just until the worst passes, she whispered to herself, arranging her pack to serve as a barrier between herself and the buffalo's innards. Just a few hours. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the howling wind and her own shivering. When Sarah awoke fully, the storm still raged. But a strange sound reached her ears, something that didn't belong to the symphony of the blizzard. A human sound, crying. Sarah froze, straining to hear above the wind. There it was again, unmistakably the cry of a child. Impossible, she thought. Her mind must be playing tricks, conjuring the very children she had set out to save. But the crying persisted, louder now, joined by a second voice. With her heart pounding, Sarah crawled from her grisly shelter into the blinding snow. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, but she stood firm, turning in a slow circle as she tried to locate the source of the cries. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the storm. "Is someone there?" A shape emerged from the whiteness, small and hunched, moving slowly toward her. As it drew closer, Sarah gasped. A child, no more than 7 years old, stumbled through the snow, half carrying, half dragging a smaller child of perhaps 4. Both were dangerously underdressed for the conditions, with only thin jackets and no hats or gloves. Sarah rushed forward, dropping to her knees before them. "Where did you come from?" she asked, already removing her outer coat to wrap around them. The older child, a boy with fear-filled eyes, pointed vaguely behind him. "Pa told us to run," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Said to find help. Ma wouldn't wake. Up." "The Kellers?" Sarah asked, though she knew it must be. "You're the Keller children." The boy nodded, his lips blue with cold. "I'm William. This is Mary, and baby James is..." He turned, his expression crumpling in panic. "He was right behind us." Sarah scanned the whiteness, dread filling her chest. "Stay here," she commanded, wrapping her coat more securely around them. "Don't move." She plunged back into the storm, calling for James as she struggled through the deepening snow. The visibility was so poor, she feared she would lose sight of the buffalo carcass and the other children, but she couldn't abandon a child. To the blizzard, a faint whimpering led her to a small drift where a tiny form lay half buried in snow. The baby, no more than 2 years old, had collapsed from exhaustion or cold. Sarah scooped him up, clutching him to her chest as she retraced her steps. By some miracle, she found her way back to the buffalo and the other children. All three were in the advanced stages of hypothermia, their small bodies dangerously cold. Without shelter, they would die within hours, perhaps minutes. Sarah looked at the grotesque refuge she had created and made a swift decision. "Inside," she said to William, pointing to the opening in the buffalo's side. "It's warm. It will keep you alive." The boy's eyes widened with horror, but survival instinct overrode disgust. With Sarah's help, all three children were soon inside, the carcass huddled together in its grim warmth. Sarah squeezed in beside them, using her body to shield them from the worst of the visual horror. "Close your eyes," she instructed, pulling a blanket from her pack to create a barrier between them and the buffalo's innards. "Pretend we're in a cave, a warm, safe cave." Little Mary's teeth chattered violently. "I want Ma," she whimpered. "I know, sweetheart," Sarah said, pulling the girl close. "We'll find her soon. First, we need to get warm." The baby, James, had yet to make a sound beyond his initial whimpering. Sarah examined him with growing concern, finding his pulse weak and his breathing shallow. She removed her innermost layers, stripping down to her thinnest shirt despite the cold, and pressed the baby's small body directly against her skin, covering them both with the blankets. Skin-to-skin contact was the fastest way to transfer warmth, a technique she had used with newborns in danger of cold death. "William," she said to the oldest, who watched with solemn eyes, "I need you to tell me what happened. How did you end up out in the storm?" The boy swallowed hard, his voice steadier, now that they were out of the wind. "Who got sick first? Then Ma, they got hot and couldn't get up. We ran out of wood and the fire died. Ma told us to stay in bed to keep warm, but then she stopped talking." His voice broke. "I tried to wake her, but she wouldn't open her eyes. Pa woke up for a little bit and told us to run to the settlement. He said someone would help us." Sarah's heart contracted painfully. If both parents were unconscious from fever, their situation was dire, possibly fatal, and these children had wandered alone in a blizzard on the slim hope of finding help miles away. "How long were you walking?" she asked, checking James's temperature again. The baby seemed marginally warmer, a good sign. William shrugged. "A long time. Mary got tired, so I carried her. Then Jamie fell down and wouldn't get up." Sarah nodded, fighting back tears at the thought of these small, brave souls battling the elements alone. "You did well, William. You kept your brother and sister alive. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard." The boy's chin trembled at the praise, the first crack in his stoic facade. "Are Ma and Pa going to die?" Sarah couldn't bring herself to lie. "I don't know, but we're going to try to help them as soon as the storm passes." Night fell, though it was barely discernible through the unrelenting blizzard. Sarah rationed her supplies carefully, giving each child small sips of water and bits of jerky from her pack. The buffalo's body provided insulation against the brutal cold, and their combined body heat created a pocket of warmth that kept death at bay. Sarah kept watch as the children finally succumbed to exhaustion, their small bodies curled against her like puppies seeking warmth. The baby remained tucked against her chest, his breathing stronger now, but still concerning. Fever had begun to show in William and Mary as well. Not surprising given their exposure and the illness that had struck their parents. As the night wore on, Sarah fought her own exhaustion, knowing that sleep might mean death if the temperature dropped further or if the children's condition worsened. She hummed softly old lullabies her mother had sung, more to keep herself awake than to soothe the already sleeping children. The bizarre nature of their shelter wasn't lost on her. In the morning, if they survived, how would she explain to these children that they had spent the night inside the carcass of a dead buffalo? The frontier bred resilience, but some experiences defied explanation. Sarah must have dozed despite her efforts, for she woke with a start to a change in the storm's sound. The howling had subsided somewhat, though snow still fell heavily. Light filtered dimly through the small openings in their shelter. Dawn had come. The children stirred, their faces flushed with fever, but their eyes clearer. Even little James made small sounds of hunger, a vast improvement from his near catatonic state the previous evening. "We need to make a fire," Sarah said, more to herself than to the children. Without warmth outside their grotesque shelter, they couldn't survive long enough to reach help. She crawled from the carcass, her muscles screaming in protest after hours of cramped immobility. The snow had drifted against the buffalo's massive form, creating a wall nearly as tall as Sarah herself. She dug through it with her hands, creating a small clearing where a fire might be possible. The task seemed impossible. Everything was wet, buried under feet of snow. But Sarah's pack held one last hope. A small tin containing precious tinder, kept dry inside oilskin wrapping and flint for sparking. If she could find even moderately dry wood, they might have a chance. The search nearly broke her resolve. Each step away from the buffalo was a battle against deep snow and persistent wind. But persistence yielded results. A fallen tree, its underside partially protected from the snow, offered wood that, while damp, might burn if coaxed properly. Sarah worked methodically, her medical training providing the patience needed for such delicate work. She built a small platform of stones, scavenged from beneath the snow, created a tent of the driest sticks, and carefully transferred a spark to her tinder. The flame that resulted was tiny, fragile, threatening to die with each gust of wind. Sarah hunched over it, shielding it with her body, adding larger sticks only when the flame seemed strong enough to survive. The fire that eventually caught was modest, nothing like the roaring blaze she craved, but it was fire nonetheless. Smoke rose in a thin column, quickly dispersed by the wind, but visible nonetheless. "Come!" she called to the children, helping them emerge from their shelter. "Warm yourselves, but carefully. Don't burn your clothes." The children huddled around the small fire, their expressions a mixture of relief and continued fear. Sarah kept the baby wrapped against her body, unwilling to expose him to the cold, even briefly. "Are we going home now?" Mary asked, her voice small. "Soon," Sarah promised, though she had no idea how they would manage the journey. Willow could perhaps carry the smaller children, but not all of them, and Sarah doubted her own ability to walk far in the deep snow. The decision was made for her when William suddenly pointed toward the horizon. "Someone's coming!" Sarah turned, squinting against the brightness of snow. A dark figure approached on horseback, moving steadily through the drifts. Fear and hope warred within her. A traveler could mean rescue, but not all who roamed the frontier had good intentions. As the rider drew closer, details emerged. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a mixture of frontier clothing and what appeared to be traditional Cherokee garments. His horse was powerful, bred for the harsh conditions, and he guided it with confident ease. He stopped a respectful distance away, assessing the strange scene before him. A woman and 3 children huddled around a small fire beside the carcass of a buffalo, half buried in snow. "I saw your smoke," he said simply, his voice deep and accented. "Not many fires burn in a blizzard." Sarah stood straighter, the baby still clutched to her chest. "We're grateful you found us. These children are ill, and their parents may be dying. We need to reach the Keller homestead as soon as possible." The man nodded, dismounting with fluid grace despite the conditions. "I am Daniel River," he said, approaching slowly to avoid frightening the children. "I scout for Fort Thompson." "Sarah Collins," she replied, "midwife from Pine Creek." Daniel's dark eyes took in the buffalo carcass, understanding dawning in his expression. "You sheltered inside," he stated, not a question but an acknowledgement of her resourcefulness. Sarah nodded, a flush warming her cheeks despite the cold. There was no alternative. "It is an old way," Daniel said with a nod of approval. "My people have used such methods in desperate times. You have saved these children with your wisdom." The simple validation from this stranger washed over Sarah like a physical sensation. No one in Pine Creek would have called her actions wisdom, more likely madness or impropriety. Yet this man, who clearly knew the brutal realities of survival on the frontier, saw only the necessity of her choice. "Can you help us reach their homestead?" Sarah asked. "It should be near Spirit Ridge." Daniel nodded. "I know of it. It is perhaps 3 miles from here." He looked at the children with assessing eyes. "The little ones can ride with me. You look strong enough to walk alongside." Sarah almost laughed at the description. She felt anything but strong after their ordeal, but she nodded gratefully. "Yes, thank you." The journey to the Keller homestead was arduous but manageable with Daniel's help. His horse carried Mary and James, while William insisted on walking like a man, though Daniel eventually convinced him to accept a short ride when his strength flagged. The Keller home appeared suddenly through the thinning snowfall, a small cabin with smoke rising weakly from its chimney, a hopeful sign that at least one of the parents remained alive and conscious enough to tend the fire. Daniel reached the door first, knocking firmly before entering. Sarah followed with the children, bracing herself for what they might find. The interior of the Keller cabin struck Sarah like a physical blow. The smell of sickness, unwashed bodies, and smoke from a dying fire that had clearly been neglected for hours. A quick glance revealed the grim situation. Elizabeth Keller lay motionless on the bed, her face flushed with fever, breathing shallow but present. Her husband Michael was slumped in a chair nearby, conscious but barely so. His eyes, glassy and unfocused as he turned toward the opening door. "Help has come," Daniel announced, his deep voice filling the small space as he helped the children inside. Michael Keller's cracked lips parted. "My children," he whispered, tears forming in his eyes as William and Mary rushed to him. Baby James, still cradled in Sarah's arms, stirred at the sound of his father's voice. "They found us in the storm," Sarah explained quickly, moving to Elizabeth's bedside to assess her condition. "They're fevered but alive, thanks to their own strength and good fortune." She wouldn't burden these parents with the full truth. Not now, when they hovered so close to death themselves. The buffalo carcass, the night spent inside a dead animal's body, the near freezing of all 3 children. These details could wait until recovery seemed more certain. "I'm Sarah Collins, a midwife from Pine Creek," she continued, placing a hand on Elizabeth's forehead. The woman burned with fever, her skin dry and hot to the touch. "And this is Daniel River, who guided us here through the snow." Michael nodded weakly, clutching his older children with trembling hands. "We prayed for help," he murmured. "God sent angels." Sarah exchanged a glance with Daniel, who had already begun working efficiently to rebuild the fire. There was nothing angelic about either of them, just 2 people accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life, doing what was necessary to prevent death. "Your wife needs medicine and cool cloths," Sarah said, opening her pack to retrieve the herbs and tinctures she had brought. "And you need rest and fluids. The children too. They've been exposed and show signs of the same fever." For the next several hours, Sarah worked methodically. She steeped willow bark and elderflower for the fevers, prepared mustard plasters for congested chests, and continuously bathed Elizabeth's face and limbs with cool water to combat the dangerous heat emanating from her body. Daniel proved an unexpectedly skilled assistant, following Sarah's instructions without question and anticipating needs before she voiced them. By nightfall, Elizabeth had stirred briefly, enough to recognize her children and take small sips of medicinal tea. Michael's condition had improved more significantly, his fever breaking under the influence of Sarah's remedies, though weakness still confined him to his bed. The children, resilient as only the young can be, responded quickly to treatment, their fevers diminishing and appetites returning. "You have healed them," Daniel remarked quietly as he and Sarah shared a simple meal of beans and salt pork from the Keller's meager stores. Sarah shook her head. "I've only helped their bodies fight. The illness must run its course." She glanced at the sleeping family, all crowded onto the cabin's 2 beds. "But I believe they'll survive now." "A few days ago," she left the thought unfinished. "They both knew what would have happened without intervention." "You risked your life," Daniel observed, studying her with those penetrating dark eyes. "For strangers." "As did you," Sarah countered. Daniel shrugged slightly. "I followed smoke. You walked into a blizzard knowing the danger." "I couldn't live with myself otherwise," Sarah admitted, the exhaustion of the past days suddenly crashing over her. "Though I admit, when I was half frozen and alone, I questioned my decision." "Courage is not the absence of fear," Daniel said, poking at the fire with a stick. "It is action despite fear." Sarah smiled faintly. "That sounds like wisdom passed down." "My grandfather's words," Daniel confirmed. "He was an elder among my people before the removal." The mention of removal brought a somber note to their conversation. Sarah knew of the forced relocation of Cherokee people years earlier, the trail of tears that had caused thousands of deaths as they were marched from their ancestral lands to designated territories farther west. "You were not forced to go?" she asked carefully. "Some avoided the soldiers," Daniel replied, his face revealing nothing of the emotions such memories must evoke. "Small groups remained hidden in mountains or settled in remote areas. Others, like my father, had already married outside the tribe and lived apart." Sarah nodded, understanding his reluctance to elaborate. Trust was precious on the frontier, especially for someone whose people had been so grievously wronged by the government. "The snow has stopped," Daniel noted, changing the subject as he glanced toward the small window. "But the drifts are deep. You cannot return to Pine Creek until paths are cleared." Sarah hadn't even considered leaving yet. "I need to stay until Elizabeth is stronger. At least 2 more days, I think." "I must report to Fort Thompson tomorrow," Daniel said. "They will. Wonder what delayed me." Sarah felt a surprising pang of disappointment at the thought of his departure. Despite knowing him for less than a day, Daniel's calm presence had become a comfort in this crisis. "Of course," she said. "You've done more than enough already. The fort will need your skills, especially after such a storm." Daniel studied her for a long moment. "I will return," he said finally, "in 3 days with supplies. The Kellers have little food remaining, and you cannot journey alone back to Pine Creek." Relief washed over Sarah, though she tried not to show how much his words affected her. "That would be most helpful. Thank you." They spoke little after that, both surrendering to exhaustion. Sarah took the small rocking chair, insisting that Daniel use the floor near the fire for his rest. As she drifted towards sleep, the events of the past days swirled in her mind. The blizzard, the buffalo, the children's faces pale with cold, and the unexpected arrival of this enigmatic man who had possibly saved them all. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off endless white. Daniel departed at first light, promising to return with provisions from the fort. Sarah turned her attention to her patients, encouraged to find all 5. Kellers awake and alert, though still weak from their ordeal. "The children said you found them in the storm," Elizabeth whispered when Sarah brought her tea. "How did you know to come?" Word reached Pine Creek that you were ill, Sarah explained, helping the woman sit up against her pillows. I couldn't ignore children in need. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. You could have died in that blizzard. But I didn't, Sarah replied simply, and neither did you or your family. That's what matters now. Over the next 2 days, a routine developed. Sarah tended to the family's medical needs, prepared meals from their dwindling supplies, and kept the fire stoked against the bitter cold that remained despite the storm's passing. William followed her like a shadow, watching her work with solemn fascination. My ma knew herbs too, he told her as she prepared a fresh poultice for his sister's chest. Before we came west, she had a garden full of medicine plants. Sarah smiled, recognizing in this serious child a potential future healer. Perhaps in spring, you can help her start a new garden here. I can bring cuttings from mine. William nodded eagerly. I'd like that. Ma says you saved us, but she doesn't. No how. She thinks you found us near the house. Sarah hesitated, unsure how much the boy remembered of their grim shelter. We found safety where we could, she said finally. Sometimes survival requires difficult choices. I remember the buffalo, William said quietly. It smelled terrible, but it was warm inside. Sarah touched his shoulder gently. You were very brave, William. Not many grown men would have had your courage. Mr. River said the old people did. That sometimes, William continued, he said it's a way to survive when there's nothing else. He's right, Sarah confirmed, wondering what else Daniel and the boy had discussed. Indigenous peoples have knowledge about survival that most settlers never learn. Is he an Indian? William asked with childish directness. He's Cherokee, Sarah corrected gently, and he knows this land better than most. We're fortunate he found us. On the 3rd day, as promised, Daniel returned. Sarah heard the approach of horses, more than one, and felt a surge of relief when she opened the door to find him dismounting from his sturdy black gelding. A second horse pulled a small sledge loaded with supplies. The fort commander sent provisions, Daniel explained, as he began unloading sacks of flour, coffee, dried meat, and other essentials. And medicines. I told him of the situation here. Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. Fort commanders weren't known for their generosity towards struggling settlers, especially those who had chosen to establish homesteads far from the protection of the fort. Captain Williams has children of his own, Daniel added, correctly interpreting her expression, and he has seen what illness can do to a family without help. Together, they carried the supplies into the cabin, where the Kellers expressed tearful gratitude. Elizabeth was now able to sit up for longer periods, and Michael could move around the cabin with support, signs that their recovery was progressing well. We can never repay such kindness, Michael said, his voice stronger than it had been days before. There is no debt, Daniel assured him. The frontier demands cooperation for survival. Sarah noticed how carefully the Kellers watched Daniel, with gratitude, but also the wariness that often characterized settler interactions with Native Americans. Daniel seemed accustomed to such scrutiny, maintaining a respectful distance while speaking with Michael about the supplies. The fort has cleared the main trails, Daniel informed Sarah as they stepped outside to fetch the last items from the sledge. We can depart for Pine Creek tomorrow if the Kellers continue to improve. Sarah nodded, though the thought of returning to Pine Creek stirred mixed feelings. The crisis here was passing, and her own small cabin called to her, but she knew what awaited in town. Martha Peterson's disapproving glances, Harold Wilson's uncomfortable silence, and the whispers that would inevitably follow when people learned. She had been stranded for days with a Cherokee scout. Does something trouble you? Daniel asked, noticing her hesitation. Sarah sighed, her breath forming a cloud in the cold air. Pine Creek has expectations for women, especially unmarried ones. My absence will have been noted, and explanations will be demanded. Daniel studied her face. You fear their judgment. Not fear, exactly, Sarah clarified, but it grows tiresome, constantly defending one's choices to people who have never stepped beyond the boundaries of convention. A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. Yet you left those boundaries behind when you rode into a blizzard. I suppose I did, Sarah acknowledged, returning his smile with a small one of her own. The moment stretched between them, comfortable, yet charged with something unspoken. Daniel was unlike any man Sarah had encountered in her years on the frontier, thoughtful, respectful of her skills, and seemingly unburdened by the need to dominate every situation as so many settler men did. I will escort you to Pine Creek, Daniel said finally, and explain the circumstances to any who question. Sarah's smile widened. That's kind, but unnecessary. I've weathered Pine Creek's disapproval before. Nevertheless, Daniel replied, I must report to the trading post there. Captain Williams wishes to know if supplies are needed after the storm. We can travel together. The prospect of Daniel's company for the journey lightened Sarah's spirits considerably, though she tried not to examine why too closely. That evening, as the Keller family slept peacefully for the first time in days, Sarah and Daniel again shared a quiet meal by the fire. The improved condition of their patients and the promise of tomorrow's journey created a sense of accomplishment that loosened Sarah's usual reserve. How did you come to scout for the fort? She asked, genuinely curious about this man who moved between worlds with such apparent ease. Daniel considered the question before answering. My father was a trader who married a Cherokee woman. My mother. I grew up learning both ways, speaking both languages. After the removal, when tensions were high, there was need for men who could communicate with remaining indigenous peoples. I could translate, knew the territories, and had no tribe to return to after my mother's people were forced west. You became a bridge, Sarah observed. Daniel nodded, though neither side fully trusts a bridge. To settlers, I remain Cherokee. To full-blooded Cherokee, I am too white. I exist between worlds. The frank admission resonated with Sarah in unexpected ways. I understand something of that, she said quietly. As a woman practicing medicine, I am neither fully accepted in the male domain of doctors nor content in the female sphere of homemaking. People tolerate my skills when needed, but question my place at every turn. You also bridge worlds, Daniel agreed. The price is belonging fully to neither. Their eyes met across the fire, and Sarah felt a connection deeper than shared circumstances, a recognition of kindred spirits who had chosen difficult paths because they could not be false to their nature. The children told me about the buffalo, Daniel said after a comfortable silence. An ingenious solution. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. It was desperate, not ingenious. I saw no alternative. Many would have perished rather than use such means, Daniel pointed out. Settlers often cling to propriety even when it costs lives. Propriety seems a luxury when children are freezing to death, Sarah replied wryly. Daniel's expression grew solemn. My people have a saying, when the choice is between dignity and survival, choose survival. Dignity can be reclaimed, life cannot. Sarah considered his words. Your people have much wisdom worth learning, as do healers like yourself, Daniel countered. Knowledge should not be bounded by race or origin. All truth has value. Such open-minded thinking was rare on the frontier, where most settlers viewed indigenous knowledge with suspicion at best, contempt at most. Sarah found herself wondering about Daniel's life at the fort, whether his progressive views were tolerated or suppressed. Do you find acceptance at Fort Thompson? She asked. Daniel's expression revealed little. I am useful to them. Acceptance is another matter. He paused, then added, Captain Williams is a fair man who judges by actions rather than ancestry. Others are less enlightened. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Pine Creek is much the same. Harold Wilson treats me with respect because my medicines helped his wife through a difficult birth. Thomas Peterson considers me an affront to proper womanhood for the same reason. A small smile touched Daniel's lips. We have both learned to navigate difficult waters. Yes, Sarah agreed, returning his smile. Though sometimes I grow weary of the constant vigilance required. The journey wears on the soul, Daniel acknowledged. But the alternative is to deny one's true nature. A slower death, but no less real. His insight struck Sarah deeply. How many women had she watched wither under the constraints of frontier society, burying their intelligence, strength, and ambitions beneath layers of enforced domesticity? How many had she pitied even as she thanked Providence for her own escape from such a fate? Tomorrow's journey will be challenging, Daniel said, changing the subject. The trails are cleared, but still treacherous. We should rest. Sarah nodded, though she felt reluctant to end their conversation. Something about Daniel's presence invited confidences she rarely shared, and his responses revealed a depth of thought she had missed in her largely solitary existence. Morning brought clear skies and marginally warmer temperatures, still below freezing, but without the deadly chill of previous days. Sarah made final preparations for departure, leaving the Kellers with detailed instructions for continuing treatment and promises to return to check their progress when weather permitted. We owe you our lives, Elizabeth said tearfully as she embraced Sarah. How can we ever repay such a debt? There is no debt, Sarah assured her, echoing Daniel's words from the day before. Only a bond between neighbors. When you're well, visit Pine Creek and introduce yourselves properly. The community should know you. Michael nodded soberly. We've kept to ourselves too much. That ends now. Near death has a way of clarifying priorities. Sarah smiled, heartened by his resolution. Pine Creek needs good people like yourselves. Don't let the Petersons intimidate you. The children's farewells were the most difficult. William presented Sarah with a small wooden carving he had been working on during his recovery. A crude but recognizable buffalo. To remember, he said simply. Sarah knelt to embrace him, deeply touched by the gift. I could never forget, William. You are the bravest boy I've ever known. Outside, Daniel had prepared both horses and the now empty sledge, which would carry Sarah's belongings and provide emergency transport if needed. Sarah mounted Willow, who had been well rested and fed during their stay at the Kellers, and with final waves to the family standing in the doorway, they set off toward Pine Creek. The journey was indeed challenging, as Daniel had predicted. Though the main trail had been partially cleared by soldiers from the fort, deep drifts remained in places, forcing them to find alternative paths through the snow-covered landscape. They traveled in companionable silence for the most part, each lost in private thoughts while remaining alert to the potential dangers around them. By midday, they paused to rest the horses and share a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits. The sun shone brilliantly overhead, transforming the winter landscape into a glittering expanse that almost hurt the eyes to behold. We make good progress, Daniel observed. We should reach Pine Creek by nightfall if the trail remains clear. Sarah nodded, shielding her eyes as she gazed toward the horizon. I've been thinking about William. He has a healer's instincts. I might offer to teach him when he's older, if his parents permit. You would take an apprentice? Daniel sounded intrigued. I've never considered it before, Sarah admitted, but watching him this week, his attentiveness, his careful observations, it would be a shame to let such natural ability go untrained. You see potential where others might not look, Daniel remarked. A valuable trait, Sarah smiled. I had a Mentor who saw potential in me when others saw only an orphaned girl with too many questions. Sometimes one person's belief is all that's needed to change a life's direction. Who was this mentor? Daniel asked. Rebecca Holloway, the midwife who delivered me and later took me in when my parents died of fever, Sarah explained. Memories, softening her voice. She practiced medicine when women weren't supposed to know such things, taught me everything. Herbs, setting bones, delivering babies, even minor surgeries. The women of 5 settlements depended on her skills. She sounds remarkable, Daniel observed. She was, Sarah agreed. Fearless, brilliant, and utterly indifferent to society's boundaries. When she died, I promised to continue her work, whatever the cost. Daniel studied her with those perceptive eyes. You honor her well. The simple validation warmed Sarah more than it should have. She had grown accustomed to defending her choices, not having them recognized as honorable. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually becoming more familiar as they approached Pine Creek. Sarah felt anxiety building in her chest as they drew nearer to civilization, a stark contrast to the peaceful, purposeful days at the Keller homestead. You grow tense, Daniel noted, as they rode side by side along a wider section of trail. Pine Creek will have questions, Sarah replied, adjusting her hat against the lowering sun. And assumptions. About us, Daniel stated, rather than asked. About everything, Sarah clarified. My departure during a storm, my absence for days, your presence with me now. It will fuel gossip for weeks. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Does their opinion matter so greatly? The question gave Sarah pause. Did it matter? Once, perhaps, when she'd first established her practice and needed the community's trust. But now, her skills spoke for themselves and those who truly needed. Her care would seek it regardless of gossip. Less than it once did, she admitted. But isolation can be its own burden. Rebecca always said a healer needs the community as much as it needs her. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. There is wisdom there. No person is truly independent, whatever we might wish to believe. They crested a small rise and suddenly Pine Creek lay before them, smoke rising from chimneys against the late afternoon sky. Sarah took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. Whatever awaits, she said with determined cheer. At least there will be hot food and warm beds tonight. Daniel smiled slightly. After a buffalo carcass, Pine Creek's accommodations should seem luxurious indeed. The unexpected humor startled a laugh from Sarah, releasing some of the tension she'd been carrying. An exceedingly low bar, Mr. River, yet one we have both experienced, he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Few in Pine Creek can claim such distinction. Still smiling, Sarah nudged Willow forward, somehow bolstered by the shared experience that now linked her to this unusual man. Whatever Pine Creek might think or say, they hadn't faced death in a blizzard or saved children using desperate measures. Their judgment suddenly seemed less consequential when weighed against the realities of survival she had faced. The first building they approached was Wilson's General Store, its windows glowing with lamplight as dusk settled over the settlement. Several horses were hitched outside, suggesting a busier evening than usual, likely residents gathering to exchange storm stories and assess damage. As they dismounted, the store's door opened, spilling golden light onto the snow. Harold Wilson himself stood framed in the doorway, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as he recognized Sarah and noted her companion. "Miss Collins," he exclaimed. "You're alive!" The dramatic greeting caught Sarah off guard. "Of course I'm alive, Harold. Why wouldn't I be?" "You rode out before the worst blizzard in 20 years, Harold sputtered. "No one's seen or heard from you in days. Martha Peterson has been saying prayers for your soul, convinced you'd frozen to death somewhere between here and Spirit Ridge." Sarah bit back a smile at the thought of Martha Peterson, of all people, praying for her soul. As you can see, I'm perfectly well. The Kellers, however, nearly weren't. The entire family had fallen ill, and the children... She was interrupted by the appearance of more faces in the doorway. Thomas Peterson pushed forward, his wife close behind him, both staring at Sarah and Daniel with undisguised curiosity. "So the Wanderer returns," Thomas said, his tone suggesting he found her survival somewhat inconvenient. "And with company, no less." His gaze flicked dismissively over Daniel, taking in his mixed attire and darker complexion with poorly concealed disdain. Sarah felt a flash of protective anger on Daniel's behalf. "Mr. River is a scout for Fort Thompson," she said firmly. "He found me assisting the Keller family and brought supplies from the fort. Captain Williams himself sent aid." The mention of the fort's commander gave Thomas pause. Association with military authority carried weight in frontier settlements. "Well," he said, less certainty in his voice, "you caused quite a stir, Miss Collins. Most thought your reckless decision had led to a fitting end." "I'm sorry to disappoint those awaiting a moral lesson in my demise," Sarah replied dryly, "but I found the Kellers gravely ill, with 3 small children suffering from fever and exposure. They would have died without intervention." Martha stepped forward, her pinched face alight with barely concealed excitement at fresh gossip. "And you and this scout have been alone together all this time? Unchaperoned?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Before Sarah could respond, Daniel spoke, his deep voice carrying authority that demanded attention. "Miss Collins was never alone," he stated calmly. "She stayed with the Keller family, tending to their medical needs day and night. Her skill and dedication saved 5 lives, including 3 children who would now be in graves, had she followed more cautious counsel." The simple, direct statement silenced Martha momentarily. Harold Wilson seized the opportunity to step forward and take Willow's reins. "You must be exhausted, Sarah," he said with genuine concern. "Come inside, both of you. Margaret has stew on the stove, and you can tell us what happened while you warm yourselves." Sarah shot him a grateful look, touched by this small kindness amid the palpable tension. "Thank you, Harold. A hot meal sounds like heaven right now." As they followed Harold inside, leaving Thomas and Martha Peterson still standing in the doorway, Sarah felt Daniel's presence steady behind her. Whatever judgments awaited within, she would face them with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared death in the face and made the hard choices necessary for survival. Pine Creek's opinions suddenly seemed very small indeed. The interior of Wilson's general store was crowded with Pine Creek residents, all of whom fell into stunned silence as Sarah and Daniel entered. Sarah recognized the familiar faces: farmers, tradesmen, and their wives who had gathered not just for supplies, but for the community that formed naturally in the wake of shared hardship. Now, their conversations halted mid-sentence as all eyes turned to assess the returned midwife and her unusual companion. Margaret Wilson, Harold's wife, pushed through the crowd with genuine warmth. "Sarah Collins, praise the Lord," she exclaimed, embracing Sarah tightly. "We feared the worst when no one had word of you after the blizzard." Sarah returned the embrace, grateful for the sincere welcome amidst the scrutiny of the others. "I'm perfectly fine, Margaret. Just tired from the journey." Margaret pulled back, studying Sarah's face before turning her attention to Daniel, who stood quietly nearby. Unlike the others, Margaret showed no hesitation in extending her hand to him. "You must be the scout Harold mentioned." "Thank you. We're bringing our Sarah home safely." Daniel took her hand with a respectful nod. "Daniel River, the credit belongs to Miss Collins. She is the one who saved the Keller family." Margaret ushered them toward the store's pot-bellied stove, where a pot of stew bubbled enticingly. "Sit, both of you. Eat while it's hot." She lowered, her voice as she ladled generous portions into bowls. "Don't mind the staring. It's the most excitement Pine Creek has seen since the Johnson twins were born with different-colored eyes." Sarah accepted the bowl gratefully, realizing how hungry she was. The rich aroma of beef and vegetables reminded her that they had eaten little during their day's journey. Daniel sat beside her, his posture relaxed but alert, clearly accustomed to being the object of curious scrutiny. Thomas and Martha Peterson had followed them inside, and Thomas now positioned himself before the stove, arms crossed, as if preparing to conduct an interrogation. The other residents gathered behind him, a silent audience to the drama unfolding. "So, Miss Collins," Thomas began, his tone implying authority he did not officially possess, "perhaps you should explain yourself to the good people of Pine Creek. Many resources were wasted in discussions of whether to send a search party for you." Sarah took her time, swallowing a spoonful of stew, refusing to be rushed. "I explained my intentions to Harold before departing. The Kellers were gravely ill, and I went to offer medical assistance. The storm became severe more quickly than anticipated, trapping me there until the weather cleared." "And how exactly did Mr. River here become involved?" Martha interjected, her thin face alight with suspicious interest. Before Sarah could respond, Daniel spoke calmly. "I was returning to Fort Thompson from a scouting mission when I observed smoke from a fire in an unlikely location. Investigation revealed Miss Collins tending to the Keller family. I reported their situation to Captain Williams, who sent supplies. With the trails partially cleared, I escorted Miss Collins back to ensure her safe return." His explanation was factual yet incomplete, omitting the buffalo carcass, the children's near death in the blizzard, and the days spent in close quarters. Sarah wondered if this was deliberate, a tactful editing of events to provide what Pine Creek needed to hear while preserving the more personal aspects of their shared experience. Thomas seemed dissatisfied with the straightforward account, and the fort took interest in settlers so far from its protection. That seems unusually charitable. Daniel met Thomas's gaze steadily. "Captain Williams recognizes that survival on the frontier requires cooperation. The Kellers have 3 young children who were ill and hungry. The fort had supplies to spare." "How fortunate for the Kellers," Martha commented, with an edge to her voice, "to receive such special attention when other families struggled through the same storm without military assistance." Sarah set down her spoon, patience waning. "The Kellers nearly died, Martha, all 5 of them. The children were burning with fever, the parents unconscious. They had no food, no medicine, and no firewood left. If you know of other families in similar dire circumstances, please tell me their names, and I will go to them immediately." Her direct challenge created an uncomfortable silence. No one stepped forward with another family in comparable distress. Harold cleared his throat, attempting to ease the tension. "What matters is that everyone survived the blizzard, and Sarah has returned safely. We should be grateful, not suspicious." Several heads nodded in agreement, though Thomas and Martha remained stony-faced. "The important question," Thomas persisted, "is what happens now. This arrangement, it cannot continue." Sarah stared at him, momentarily confused. "What arrangement?" "Your association with Mr. River," Martha clarified, as if speaking to a child. "Traveling alone together, returning to town in each other's company. People will talk, Sarah. Your reputation." "My reputation," Sarah interrupted, setting her bowl aside and standing, "has endured Pine Creek speculation for years, Martha. I doubt this will make much difference." "But it does make a difference," Thomas insisted. "A woman of your standing, unchaperoned with a—" He paused, glancing at Daniel with poorly concealed disdain. "With a what, Mr. Peterson?" Daniel asked, quietly rising to stand beside Sarah. Though his tone remained calm, something in his posture suggested a warning. Thomas faltered, suddenly aware that his next words could prove problematic. "With a man not from our community," he finished. Lamely, an older man stepped forward from the crowd, Jacob Miller, whose wife Sarah had helped through 3 difficult childbirths. "Thomas, that's enough. Sarah saved my Eleanor and our youngest. If she says she was tending the sick, that's good enough for me. And if this man helped her return safely, then he deserves our thanks, not our suspicion." Several others murmured, agreement, creating a visible divide in the gathered residents. Thomas, sensing his position weakening, adopted a different approach. "I'm merely concerned for Miss Collins's welfare," he said, his tone softening unconvincingly. "A single woman must guard her reputation carefully. Perhaps it would be best if Mr. River continued to the fort tonight, rather than remaining in Pine Creek." Sarah felt a surge of indignation at this thinly veiled attempt to separate her from Daniel. "Mr. River has traveled all day after assisting a family in crisis. He deserves rest and proper accommodations before continuing his journey. He can stay in our spare room," Harold offered unexpectedly, "above the store. It's simple but clean." Sarah shot Harold a grateful look, touched by his willingness to defy Thomas's implied command. Daniel inclined his head to Harold. "Your hospitality is appreciated," he said. "I must report to the fort tomorrow, but a night's rest would be welcome first." With the matter settled, albeit awkwardly, the store's atmosphere gradually relaxed. People returned to their previous conversations, though Sarah noticed many glances still directed their way. She finished her meal in relative peace, aware of Daniel's steady presence beside her and the curious mix of allies and detractors surrounding them. As the evening progressed, several residents approached individually to welcome Sarah back and inquire about her experience. These quieter, more personal interactions revealed a community more nuanced than Thomas Peterson's judgmental stance would suggest. Jacob Miller's wife Eleanor brought Sarah a fresh loaf of bread and whispered, "Don't let them trouble you. Most of us are just glad you're safe." Even more surprising, several people engaged Daniel directly, asking respectful questions about conditions around the fort and whether other settlements had weathered the storm without casualties. Each time, Daniel answered with a thoughtful thoroughness that gradually earned nods of approval from his questioners. By the time most residents had departed for their homes, the store's atmosphere had transformed from tense confrontation to tentative acceptance. Harold showed Daniel to the spare room upstairs, while Margaret insisted Sarah stay with them for the night rather than return alone to her cabin on the settlement's edge. "You can fetch your things tomorrow," Margaret said, as she prepared a small bedroom off the main living quarters. "Tonight, you need proper rest." Sarah accepted gratefully, her body finally registering the full exhaustion of the past week's events. As Margaret bustled about, arranging blankets and lighting a small lamp, she spoke without looking directly at Sarah. "Daniel River seems a good man," she observed casually. "Not what I expected from Thomas's blustering." Sarah smiled faintly. "He is a good man. Without his help, I might not have made it back from the Kellers, and they certainly wouldn't have received the supplies that will see them through recovery." Margaret nodded, finally turning to face Sarah. "And the rest, the things you haven't told us about what happened out there?" Sarah hesitated, uncertain how much to share, even with sympathetic Margaret. "The storm was worse than anything I've experienced. Survival required unconventional solutions." A knowing look crossed Margaret's face. "Sometimes convention is a luxury the frontier doesn't afford us." She patted Sarah's hand. "Whatever happened, you returned alive and helped others do the same. The rest is between you and your conscience." "Thank you, Margaret," Sarah said softly, touched by the woman's understanding. "Now rest," Margaret instructed, moving toward the door. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Those words proved prophetic. Sarah woke to bright sunlight, and the sounds of Pine Creek already bustling with activity. She dressed quickly in the clean clothes Margaret had provided. Her own things were still with Willow's saddlebags, and joined the Wilsons for a breakfast of cornbread and coffee. Daniel was already seated at the table, engaged in conversation with Harold about the fort's assessment of damage from the blizzard. He nodded a greeting to Sarah, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts on their reception the previous evening. Captain Williams believes this was the worst storm in at least 15 years, Daniel was saying. 3 soldiers died when their patrol was caught exposed on the plains. We've had reports of significant livestock losses from the ranches north of here. Harold shook his head grimly. Not surprising. We lost 2 milk cows ourselves, and the Johnsons lost a prized bull. Spring will be harder without them. Sarah listened as they continued discussing the storm's impact, grateful for the mundane normalcy of their conversation after yesterday's tension. Margaret placed a steaming mug before her with a sympathetic smile. "Sleep well?" she asked quietly. Sarah nodded, wrapping her hands around the welcome warmth of the mug. "Better than I have in days. Thank you for your hospitality." "You're always welcome here," Margaret assured her. "Both of you," she added with a meaningful glance toward Daniel. After breakfast, Sarah prepared to collect her things and check on her cabin, which had stood empty during her absence. Daniel accompanied her to where Willow had been stabled behind the store, his own horse already saddled for departure. "You return to the fort today?" Sarah asked, feeling an unexpected reluctance at the thought of his leaving. Daniel nodded. "Captain Williams will expect my report, but I'll return in a few days, if acceptable. The fort wishes to establish regular contact with outlying settlements after the storm to ensure no further assistance is needed." Sarah understood this was likely a diplomatic extension of his actual orders, a way to justify returning to Pine Creek that wouldn't raise eyebrows. At the fort or in the settlement, the knowledge that she would see him again lifted her spirits considerably. "That would be most helpful," she replied, matching his formal tone while hoping her eyes conveyed more. "I plan to check on the Kellers again next week. Perhaps our journeys could coincide." A slight smile touched Daniel's lips. "I believe that could be arranged." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Thomas Peterson, accompanied by Reverend Caldwell, the settlement's pastor. The Reverend was a thin, serious man whose theological interests ran more toward hellfire than heavenly mercy. Sarah steeled herself, recognizing the deliberate nature of this confrontation. "Miss Collins, Mr. River," Reverend Caldwell greeted, them with a stiff nod. "I understand you've had quite an adventure." "An ordeal rather than an adventure, Reverend," Sarah corrected gently. "The Keller family nearly perished." Yes, very unfortunate." The Reverend dismissed her point with a wave. "Mr. Peterson has brought a matter of community concern to my attention. It seems your situation during the blizzard may have compromised propriety." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with annoyance. "My situation involved treating 5 desperately ill people, including 3 children. Propriety was hardly my primary concern." "Nevertheless," Thomas interjected, "appearances matter greatly in a Christian community. Reverend Caldwell and I believe steps must be taken to address potential impropriety." Daniel, who had been silently observing the exchange, spoke with deceptive calmness. "What impropriety do you suggest occurred, Mr. Peterson?" "Miss Collins was attending the sick. I delivered supplies and escorted her safely home when the trails cleared. Where is the indiscretion?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably under Daniel's steady gaze. "The extended period of unchaperoned association, the private nature of your return journey, the obvious familiarity between you now." "Familiarity?" Sarah repeated incredulously. We survived a life-threatening situation together and cooperated to save a family. Should we instead be strangers? Reverend Caldwell cleared his throat. The solution is simple and biblical. Marriage would remove any stain upon Miss Collins's reputation and legitimize your association. The suggestion landed like a physical blow. Sarah stood speechless, unable to formulate a response to this outrageous proposal. Marriage? To a man she had known for barely a week, simply to appease Pine Creek's sense of propriety. Daniel's expression remained impressively neutral, though Sarah noticed his shoulders tense slightly. "Reverend Caldwell," he said evenly, "while I hold Miss Collins in the highest esteem, neither of us has expressed any intention toward marriage. Your suggestion seems premature at best. And intrusive at worst," Sarah added, finding her voice. "My reputation is my own concern, not a matter for community management." Thomas's face reddened. "This is precisely the independent attitude that causes concern. A proper woman would recognize the wisdom in our counsel." "A proper woman," Sarah countered, anger giving her words unusual heat, "would not have ridden into a blizzard to save strangers. She would have stayed home, safe and useless, while the Kellers died. Is that the propriety you value, Mr. Peterson?" The Reverend appeared taken aback by her vehemence. Daniel stepped slightly closer to Sarah, not touching her, but offering silent support through his proximity. "We merely suggest," Reverend Caldwell began. "You suggest I should marry to satisfy gossip," Sarah interrupted. "I suggest that my medical practice and Mr. Rivers' duties to the fort are not subject to Pine Creek's approval. Now, if you'll excuse us, we both have responsibilities to attend to." With that, she turned to Willow and busied herself checking the saddle straps, effectively dismissing both men. After an awkward moment, they withdrew, Thomas muttering something to the Reverend that Sarah couldn't hear. Once they were out of earshot, Sarah let out a long breath, her hands shaking slightly with suppressed emotion. "I apologize you were subjected to that," she said quietly to Daniel. To her surprise, a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "It's not the first time someone has suggested I marry to become acceptable to their community, though usually they propose their daughters, not themselves." The unexpected humor broke Sarah's tension, and she found herself smiling in return. "I'm not certain whether to be flattered they consider you an acceptable match despite their prejudices, or insulted they think my reputation requires such drastic salvaging." "Perhaps both," Daniel suggested, adjusting his horse's bridle. "Though I would point out that they seemed more concerned with your reputation than mine. Apparently, as a Cherokee scout, I have no reputation worth protecting." Sarah laughed softly, grateful for his ability to find irony in the situation, a small blessing amid the absurdity. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the peculiar intimacy they had developed through shared crisis, and perhaps a question about what might follow. Daniel broke the moment first, swinging easily onto his horse. "I'll return within the week," he said. "Perhaps by then Pine Creek will have found a new source of gossip." "Unlikely," Sarah replied wryly. "We may be their favorite topic until spring thaw at least." Daniel nodded, a hint of that smile still lingering. "Until then, Miss Collins." With a tip of his hat, he turned his horse and rode toward the trail that would lead him back to Fort Thompson. Sarah watched him go, feeling a complex mixture of emotions she wasn't quite ready to examine closely. The next few days established a new routine for Sarah. She returned to her cabin, finding it mercifully undamaged by the storm, and resumed her normal responsibilities. Several children had developed coughs following the blizzard, and an elderly man had fallen on ice, requiring her attention to a badly sprained wrist. The familiar work grounded her, though she couldn't help noticing the way conversations sometimes halted when she entered the general store, or how certain women drew their children closer when she passed. Martha Peterson proved particularly relentless in her campaign of whispered innuendo, Sarah overheard her telling Mrs. Johnson in the Mercantile that some women forget their place so completely they'd consort with savages rather than accept a proper Christian husband. Rather than confronting Martha directly, Sarah chose to focus on those who showed her continued respect and appreciation. Eleanor Miller brought freshly baked bread and stayed for tea, during which she shared her genuine curiosity about the Kellers' condition. Jacob and I were thinking we might call on them when the trails improve further, Eleanor suggested. New families need connections, especially after such an ordeal. Sarah welcomed this initiative, recognizing it as the frontier's true salvation. Not judgment, but practical assistance and human connection. They would appreciate that greatly. Elizabeth mentioned she hopes to plant a substantial garden come spring. Perhaps you could advise her on what grows well in our soil. Such positive interactions sustained Sarah through the undercurrent of disapproval she encountered elsewhere. She determinedly maintained her normal schedule, refusing to hide away as if ashamed. When young William Keller's wooden buffalo fell from her pocket during a visit to Wilson's store, she simply picked it up and placed it prominently on her purchase counter, meeting Harold's curious gaze directly. William carved it, she explained without elaboration. A remarkably resourceful boy. Harold nodded, wisely asking no further questions about the carving's significance. But later, as Sarah was leaving, he mentioned casually, Daniel River stopped at the fort's trading post yesterday, purchased medical supplies to be delivered here on his next visit. Thought you might want to know. Sarah thanked him, careful to keep her expression neutral despite the warmth that bloomed in her chest at this information. Daniel was indeed planning to return, and he had thought to bring supplies she might need. The gesture spoke to an understanding of her work that few in Pine Creek demonstrated. 4 days after Daniel's departure, Sarah decided to visit the Kellers again. The weather had remained clear, and reports suggested the trails were now passable with reasonable caution. She packed medicines, food supplies donated by the Millers and Wilsons, and small gifts for the children. A wooden top for William, a rag doll Margaret had sewn for Mary, and a soft ball for baby James. As she prepared Willow for the journey, early the following morning, a rider approached from the direction of the fort. Sarah's heart quickened as she recognized Daniel's distinctive silhouette against the rising sun. He rode directly to her cabin, dismounting with the fluid grace she had come to appreciate. "You're preparing to travel," he observed, noting Willow's saddled state. Sarah nodded. "To the Kellers. I want to check their recovery and bring supplies." "I've come for the same purpose," Daniel said. "Captain Williams asked me to confirm their condition and determine if further assistance is needed." Sarah wondered if this was entirely true, or partly a diplomatic fiction to explain his return to Pine Creek. Either way, she was grateful for his company on the journey. "I understand you purchased medical supplies," she mentioned as they prepared to depart. A flicker of surprise crossed Daniel's face. News travels quickly in small settlements. "Harold mentioned it," Sarah explained. "He's been surprisingly supportive, despite Thomas's efforts to turn opinion against us." "Against you," Daniel corrected gently. "I am merely passing through. You must live with these people." The observation sobered Sarah. "Yes, though sometimes I wonder if Pine Creek is where I belong long-term." Rebecca practiced in multiple settlements, never tying herself too firmly to any one community's expectations. Daniel considered this as they guided their horses onto the trail. "And is that what you want? A more nomadic existence?" "I'm not certain," Sarah admitted. "Until recently, Pine Creek felt sufficient if occasionally stifling. Now..." She trailed off, unable to articulate the restlessness that had taken root since their shared ordeal. "Crisis changes perspective," Daniel observed. "What once seemed important diminishes. What was overlooked suddenly matters greatly. Sarah nodded, struck by how precisely he had captured her internal shift. Yes, exactly that. They rode in companionable silence for a time. The winter landscape spread before them in sparkling white waves. Eventually, curiosity prompted Sarah to ask, "How were you received at the fort after our adventure?" Daniel's expression revealed mild amusement, with less dramatic speculation than Pine Creek offered, though not without interest. Captain Williams values results over methods, so my report of the Keller's survival satisfied him. Others asked more pointed questions about you. About me? Sarah was surprised. Why? A woman healer willing to ride into a blizzard intrigues them, Daniel explained, particularly when she employs survival techniques few white settlers would consider. The buffalo Carcass story has spread among the soldiers. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. You told them about that. Not in detail, Daniel assured her. Merely that you showed exceptional resourcefulness in protecting the children. The rest they inferred from my mention of finding you near a fallen buffalo. Sarah sighed. So now I'm the subject of fort gossip, as well as Pine Creek's. But with a significant difference, Daniel pointed out. At the fort, the story has made you something of a legend, a frontier healer with the courage and ingenuity of any soldier. In Pine Creek, I'm a woman who violated propriety by sharing trials with a Cherokee scout. Sarah finished dryly. The same actions viewed through entirely different perspectives. Daniel nodded. The lens of prejudice distorts everything it views. The simple truth of this statement resonated deeply with Sarah. How often had she been judged not for her actions, but for who she was? How often had Daniel faced the same, but magnified by racial prejudice alongside the gender expectations she battled? It seems we have more in common than circumstances initially suggested, she observed. Daniel smiled faintly. I recognized a kindred spirit in you that first day watching you tend the Kellers with such determination. Some souls are shaped differently, unable to conform to the patterns others would impose. The recognition in his words touched Sarah profoundly. Before she could respond, they crested a hill and caught sight of smoke rising from the chimney of the Keller homestead in the distance. They've maintained their fire, Daniel noted approvingly. A good sign. Sarah nodded, anticipation rising as they approached the small cabin. Whatever uncertain future awaited in Pine Creek or elsewhere, today offered the simple satisfaction of checking on a family they had saved together. For now, that was enough. The transformation of the Keller homestead in just a few days was remarkable. As Sarah and Daniel approached, they found Michael Keller outside splitting wood, his movement still somewhat labored, but his strength clearly returning. He paused mid-swing when he spotted them, a broad smile breaking across his weathered face. "Miss Collins, Mr. River," he called, setting his axe aside and moving to greet them. "What a welcome sight you are." Sarah dismounted, accepting Michael's enthusiastic handshake. "I'm delighted to see you on your feet, Mr. Keller. You've made impressive progress." "Thanks to you," he replied earnestly, before turning to shake Daniel's hand with equal vigor. "Both of you. Please come inside. Elizabeth will be overjoyed to see you." The cabin's interior was markedly different from their last visit. The oppressive atmosphere of illness had given way to the humble but dignified home of a recovering family. Elizabeth sat at a small table, teaching Mary to shape dough into rolls. The toddler, James, played on a blanket nearby, and William was carefully whittling a piece of wood by the fire. At the visitors' entrance, all activity ceased as joyful recognition spread across their faces. "Miss Collins!" William was the first to react, rushing towards Sarah with unrestrained enthusiasm. He stopped just short of embracing her, suddenly conscious of appearing too childish. Sarah solved his dilemma by kneeling to his level and offering her arms, which he gratefully entered. You've grown taller in just a week, she teased gently, struck by how much healthier he looked, his eyes bright, his cheeks filled with natural color rather than fever's flush. I've been eating everything Ma cooks, he reported proudly, and helping Pa with chores. Elizabeth rose from the table, wiping flour from her hands as she came to greet them. Though still thin, she moved with purpose rather than the desperate weakness of before. We prayed you would visit, she said, embracing Sarah warmly before offering a respectful nod to Daniel. There's so much we want to say. Mary had overcome her initial shyness and now tugged at Sarah's skirt, eager to show her a crude drawing, made with charcoal on a scrap of paper. Even little James, who had been so desperately ill, crawled energetically toward the visitors, babbling happily. We've brought supplies, Daniel announced, retrieving packages from his saddlebags. Medicine, coffee, sugar, and seeds for spring planting. Michael's eyes widened at this unexpected generosity. The fort continues to provide for us? We're beyond grateful. Daniel's expression remained neutral, though Sarah detected a slight tension in his shoulders. She wondered if the fort had actually authorized these supplies or if Daniel had procured them through other means. His next words confirmed her suspicion. Some items are from the fort, he clarified. Others are personal contributions. Sarah added her own bundles to the table. These are from families in Pine Creek, the Millers and Wilsons specifically. They hope to visit when the trails improve further, and these, she produced the small gifts, are for the children. The simple presents were received with disproportionate joy, Mary clutching her ragdoll with reverent delight, William immediately testing his top on the wooden floor, and James happily gumming the soft fabric ball. You must stay for a meal, Elizabeth insisted. It's the least we can offer. Sarah glanced at Daniel, who nodded his agreement. We'd be honored, she replied. The meal that followed was simple, but represented the Kellers' returning health and prosperity. Venison stew, fresh bread, and precious dried apples, stewed with cinnamon for dessert. The conversation flowed naturally, focusing on practical matters of recovery and preparation for the remaining winter months. Mr. River showed me how to set snares, William announced proudly. I caught 2 rabbits yesterday. Daniel nodded. Confirmation. He has a natural aptitude, quick to learn and patient in application. Sarah noted how William straightened under this praise, his chest puffing slightly with pride. The boy clearly hungered for male approval, and Daniel had provided it with a simple, genuine acknowledgement of his abilities. As the meal concluded, Elizabeth enlisted Mary's help, clearing dishes, while Michael took James for his nap. Finding themselves momentarily alone with William, Sarah seized the opportunity to assess his continued interest in healing. I noticed you watching when I mixed medicines for your family, she remarked casually. Did you find it interesting? William nodded eagerly. Yes, Mom. I like knowing what plants can do. Ma says you might teach me someday. Sarah smiled. I might indeed if your parents approve. Not every boy has the temperament for healing. Work, but I think you might. Because I'm patient, William stated matter-of-factly, repeating Daniel's earlier assessment of his character. Exactly, Sarah agreed. Healing requires patience, observation, and courage, all qualities you've demonstrated. The boy considered this with solemn seriousness. Would I have to go live in Pine Creek to learn? Pa needs me here. Sarah glanced at Daniel, who had been listening quietly to their exchange. Not necessarily. I could visit regularly, bring books and supplies. You could learn gradually while continuing to help your family. Like an apprentice, Daniel suggested, but adapted to frontier circumstances. William's face brightened at this pragmatic solution. I'd like that, and maybe I could help when neighbors get sick like you helped us. That's precisely how healing knowledge should spread, Sarah affirmed, genuinely touched by the boys' instinctive understanding of community responsibility. When Michael returned, the conversation shifted to the Kellers' longer-term plans. They had arrived on the frontier less than a year before, and the blizzard had severely tested their preparation and resolve. "We've discussed returning east," Michael admitted, his expression troubled. "Elizabeth's family in Ohio would welcome us, especially after this close call. But this is our home now," Elizabeth finished firmly, rejoining them at the table. "We've worked too hard to abandon it at the first serious challenge." Sarah understood their conflict. The frontier offered freedom and opportunity, but demanded harsh payment in hardship and isolation. Many families retreated after discovering the reality behind the romantic notion of Western settlement. "The first year is always the most difficult," she offered. "Each season teaches vital lessons about this land." Daniel nodded agreement. "And connection with neighbors becomes essential. No family survives in isolation here." "That's partly why we're staying," Elizabeth said. "After experiencing such kindness from strangers, from both of you, from the fort, from families in Pine Creek who've sent gifts without even meeting us, how could we abandon the community forming around us?" Sarah felt unexpected emotion tighten her throat at Elizabeth's words. This was the frontier at its best, not the suspicion and judgment displayed by Thomas Peterson, but the genuine human connection that transcended differences and distances. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah conducted thorough medical examinations of each family member. All showed remarkable improvement, though she left additional medicines and detailed instructions for Elizabeth regarding continued treatment and prevention of relapse. "William can help measure the dosages," Sarah suggested, noting how the boy straightened with responsibility at her words. "He has a careful eye for detail." Outside, as they prepared for departure, Michael insisted on loading their horses with gifts. Fresh venison, hand-carved wooden spoons, and a beautifully woven blanket that Elizabeth had apparently worked on, a day and night since their last visit. "It isn't nearly enough," Michael said, his voice rough with emotion, "but we hope you'll accept these tokens of our gratitude." Sarah accepted graciously, recognizing that allowing the Kellers to give something in return was an important part of preserving their dignity after receiving so much assistance. Daniel similarly received their gifts with respectful acknowledgement rather than protest. As they mounted to leave, William approached Daniel's horse, looking up with unwavering determination. "Mr. River, would you teach me more about tracking when you visit again? Pa knows some, but he says you know signs he's never even noticed." Daniel considered the boy thoughtfully before nodding. "When I return, we will begin with identifying animal tracks in snow. It's the easiest season for learning." William's face lit with excitement, and he turned to Sarah. "And you'll bring a book about plants for when spring comes?" "I promise," Sarah replied, warmed by his enthusiasm. "My old botany journal has drawings of every medicinal plant in this region." The Kellers stood together as a family, waving until Sarah and Daniel disappeared over the rise that would take them back toward Pine Creek. Neither spoke immediately as they rode, both processing the profound satisfaction of seeing a family restored to health and purpose after such a close encounter with tragedy. "They will do well," Daniel observed finally, breaking the companionable silence. "They have learned the frontier's most important lesson. Interdependence," Sarah surmised, understanding precisely what he meant. "The balance between self-reliance and community connection." Daniel nodded. "Many never grasp it. They either isolate completely or depend too heavily on others. The Kellers will find the middle path." They rode at a leisurely pace, tacitly agreeing to enjoy the journey rather than rush its conclusion. The winter landscape had transformed since their last passage. Many snowdrifts had partially melted and refrozen into sculptural formations that caught the late afternoon light in dazzling ways. Though still cold, the air lacked the bitter, life-threatening chill of the blizzard days. "William has unusual potential," Daniel remarked as they navigated a particularly beautiful stretch of trail where ice crystals had formed delicate structures on tree branches. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "I've rarely seen such natural aptitude in one so young. His observation skills, his memory for details, his genuine concern for others, these can't be taught." "He watches you with great admiration," Daniel noted. "You've become something of a hero to him." Sarah felt a flush of pleasure at this observation. "I've never considered taking an apprentice before. Rebecca always said the right student would appear when the time was right." "And you believe William might be that student?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Possibly. Though frontier circumstances complicate traditional apprenticeship, I can't expect the Kellers to send him to Pine Creek regularly, especially given recent tensions." Daniel glanced at her. "You mean the community's reaction to our association?" "Yes," Sarah acknowledged. "If William were to study with me, he might face similar judgment by extension. I wouldn't want to burden a child with that." "Yet healing knowledge must be passed on," Daniel observed, "particularly in remote areas where medical assistance is scarce." "I've been thinking about Rebecca's approach," Sarah said, an idea forming. As she spoke, "She never confined herself to one settlement, but traveled a circuit of several communities. Perhaps I've become too rooted in Pine Creek, too concerned with their approval." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "A circuit would allow you to serve more families, reach students like William, who show promise but cannot travel, limit exposure to any single community's judgment." "Exactly," Sarah felt, growing excitement as the concept took shape. "I have medical supplies, a reliable horse, the knowledge to sustain myself on journeys. What's kept me tethered to Pine Creek except habit and the false hope of eventual acceptance?" "Such a change would not be without challenges," Daniel cautioned. "Winter travel, as we've experienced, carries serious risks. Settlements might resist. A healer who divides her attention rather than remaining exclusively theirs." "True," Sarah acknowledged, "but is that so different from what I face now? Pine Creek tolerates my practice, but never fully embraces it. Perhaps serving multiple communities would actually strengthen my position, make my skills too valuable across too wide an area to be undermined by any single settlement's disapproval." Daniel nodded slowly. "There is wisdom in creating a network, rather than depending on a single point of connection." They rode in thoughtful silence for a time, the possibilities of this new direction expanding in Sarah's mind. A circuit that included Pine Creek, the Kellers' homestead, perhaps other isolated families, possibly even the fort. The thought of regular proximity to Fort Thompson, and by extension to Daniel, sent an unexpected warmth through Sarah's chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of riding. She glanced at his profile, struck anew by the quiet strength he projected, the careful consideration he gave each word and action. "Would the fort welcome a visiting healer?" she asked, striving to keep her tone professionally curious rather than personally invested. Daniel turned to meet her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. "The fort's doctor is overworked and undertrained. Many soldiers and nearby settlers would benefit from additional medical attention." He paused before adding, "Captain Williams has specifically mentioned the value someone with your skills might provide." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. "The captain has discussed me?" "After my report of the Kellers' situation, yes. He was impressed by your willingness to risk personal safety to aid a family unknown to you." Daniel's mouth curved in a slight smile. "I may have emphasized your medical expertise and resourcefulness in challenging conditions." "Did you, indeed?" Sarah couldn't help returning his smile. "How fortunate that your report portrayed me in such a positive light." "I merely stated facts," Daniel replied. though the warmth in his eyes suggested he was well aware of his advocacy on her behalf. As the trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file, Sarah found herself contemplating this new information. The fort's interest presented possibilities she hadn't previously considered. A base for operations beyond Pine Creek's influence, access to supplies and information, protection during the vulnerable periods of travel between settlements, and Danielle. Regular interaction with Daniel, whose company she had come to value more than she cared to admit. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when they emerged from a wooded section of trail onto a rise overlooking Pine Creek. The settlement looked almost picturesque from this distance, smoke rising from chimneys, the general store's windows glowing with early lamplight, figures moving purposefully between buildings as day's end approached. "We should reach town before full dark," Daniel observed, guiding his horse alongside hers once more. Sarah nodded, suddenly reluctant to return to Pine Creek's constraints after the freedom and purpose she had experienced at the Kellers and in her conversations with Daniel. "Will you stay in town tonight?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "If the Wilsons offer their spare room again." "Yes," Daniel replied. "I should return to the fort tomorrow to report on the Kellers' progress." Sarah felt a pang of disappointment at how quickly his departure would follow their arrival. "Of course, the captain will want your assessment." Daniel studied her face for a moment before adding, "However, I expect to return within the week. The fort is establishing regular patrols to outlying areas following the blizzard, and I've requested the route that includes Pine Creek and the Keller homestead." The information lightened Sarah's mood considerably. That seems a sensible precaution after such a severe storm. "Indeed," Daniel agreed, his expression suggesting he understood perfectly the personal satisfaction beneath her professional response. As they descended toward Pine Creek, Sarah found herself oddly energized rather than exhausted by the day's journey. Her mind hummed with possibilities for a new approach to her practice, expanded by Daniel's implicit support and the fort's potential interest in her services. Their arrival in town drew less attention than their previous return, though Sarah noticed several residents watching their approach with undisguised curiosity. She guided Willow directly to Wilson's store, where Harold emerged to greet them. "Back safe, I see," he said with genuine warmth. "How are the Kellers faring?" "Remarkably well," Sarah reported as she dismounted. "All 5 recovering steadily with no complications from their illness." Harold nodded approvingly. "Good news indeed. Margaret will want details. She's been organizing a proper welcome package from several families. Seems your mention of them sparked genuine interest in extending community support." Sarah felt a surge of appreciation for the Wilsons' practical kindness. They would welcome visitors when the trails improve further. Elizabeth Keller mentioned feeling especially isolated during the winter months. "Understandable," Harold agreed. "Margaret was just saying we should organize a proper barn raising come spring. The Kellers' current structure is barely adequate for their livestock." This evidence of Pine Creek's better nature, the impulse toward community assistance rather than judgment, strengthened Sarah's conviction that a circuit approach could work. Not everyone in the settlement shared Thomas Peterson's rigid views. "Mr. River," Harold continued, turning to Daniel, "our spare room is available if you require lodging before returning to the fort." Daniel inclined his head gratefully. "Your hospitality is appreciated, Mr. Wilson." A commotion down the street drew their attention. Thomas Peterson was emerging from the church with Reverend Caldwell, their expressions suggesting a serious discussion had been interrupted by the arrival's return. Sarah suppressed a sigh, recognizing the determination in Thomas's stride as he approached. "Miss Collins," he greeted her stiffly, pointedly ignoring Daniel. "The church council has been in session regarding your situation." Sarah maintained a neutral expression with effort. I wasn't aware my medical practice required church council oversight, Mr. Peterson. Thomas's jaw tightened. Your moral conduct affects the entire community, as Reverend Caldwell has made clear. Your continued association with certain individuals, despite counsel to the contrary, suggests a troubling disregard for propriety. Daniel remained impassive beside her, though Sarah sensed his heightened attention. Harold shifted uncomfortably, clearly disliking the confrontation occurring at his establishment's doorstep. I've just returned from providing medical assistance to a family recovering from near-fatal illness, Sarah replied evenly. If the church council wishes to discuss morality, perhaps we should begin with our collective responsibility to outlying settlers in crisis. Reverend Caldwell stepped forward, his thin face set in righteous lines. Miss Collins, your dedication to healing is not in question. It is your defiance of social conventions that concerns us. As spiritual leaders, with respect, Reverend. Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. I don't recall Christ refusing to travel with Samaritans or condemning those who cross social boundaries to aid the suffering. The biblical reference clearly caught the Reverend off guard. He blinked rapidly, his prepared lecture momentarily derailed. Thomas, however, was not so easily diverted. The council has decided, he announced with smug finality, that your practice in Pine Creek must either conform to appropriate standards of female conduct or be discontinued. Sarah felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Discontinued? You propose to prevent me from treating the sick because I don't conform to your personal standards of behavior. The standards of Christian society, Thomas corrected with sharp emphasis. You can continue your work under proper supervision, perhaps assisting Dr. Jenkins when he visits monthly from Riverford. But independent practice, traveling unchaperoned, associating with unsuitable companions, these cannot continue if you wish to remain respected in Pine Creek. The ultimatum hung in the air between them. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions, anger at the presumption, dismay at the potential loss of her practice in a community she had served faithfully for years, and surprisingly, a sense of clarity and resolution that had been building since her conversations with Daniel. I see, she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. And who comprises this church council that claims authority over medical care in the territory? Thomas straightened, clearly affronted by her questioning. Myself, Reverend Caldwell, James Whitaker, and Benjamin Scott, all respected men of appropriate standing. None of whom possess medical training, Sarah observed. None of whom rode into a blizzard to save the Kellers. None of whom have ever delivered a child, set a broken bone, or treated fever in the middle of the night. That is hardly relevant, Thomas began. It is entirely relevant, Sarah countered. You propose to regulate medical care without medical knowledge, to place your perception of propriety above human suffering, to potentially deprive families of treatment because you disapprove of who provides it. Harold cleared his throat. Thomas, surely this is excessive. Sarah has served Pine Creek faithfully for years. Many of us, including my Margaret, might not be alive without her skills. Thomas's expression hardened. The council's decision is final. Miss Collins has until the end of the week to decide her course. Either she accepts appropriate limitations on her activities, or she must find another community more tolerant of her unconventional attitudes. With that, he turned and strode away, Reverend Caldwell following after a moment's hesitation. Sarah stood motionless, processing the magnitude of the threat to her livelihood and purpose. They cannot do this, Harold protested, genuine distress in his voice. Half the settlement would object. They can certainly try, Sarah replied, her initial shock giving way to a strange, calm clarity. The decision she had been contemplating during the ride from the Kellers suddenly seemed not just appealing, but necessary. Fortunately, Pine Creek is not the only settlement requiring medical care. Daniel, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, now spoke. "The circuit you were considering?" Sarah nodded, meeting his gaze with growing conviction. "Yes. Perhaps Thomas has simply accelerated a necessary change." Harold looked between them, confusion evident. "Circuit? What circuit?" Sarah turned to him, her mind already arranging practicalities. "A healing circuit, Harold, serving multiple settlements and homesteads rather than remaining exclusively in Pine Creek, similar to how Reverend Caldwell's predecessor traveled. Between several communities before Pine Creek became large enough to support a permanent pastor." Understanding dawned on Harold's face. "You'd still treat patients here, but also at the Kellers, other outlying farms, perhaps even the fort," Daniel supplied quietly, "where Captain Williams has expressed interest in supplementary medical services." Harold's eyebrows rose. "That's actually quite sensible. Many settlements are too small for a dedicated healer, but still need regular medical attention." "Precisely," Sarah agreed, feeling more certain with each moment. "Rebecca always said a healer belongs to the frontier, not to any single community. I've simply forgotten that wisdom by becoming too comfortable in one place." "Where would you live?" Harold asked practically. "A circuit requires a base of operations." Sarah had already considered this. "My cabin is small but sufficient. I'd maintain it as my primary residence while traveling for portions of each month." "The Wilsons will still welcome you," Harold assured her firmly. "Whatever the church council declares." Sarah reached out to squeeze his arm gratefully. "Thank you, Harold. Your friendship means more than I can express." As they led their horses to the stable behind Wilson's store, Sarah felt a peculiar lightness despite the confrontation with Thomas. The threat to her position in Pine Creek, rather than devastating her, had crystallized the new direction that had been forming in her mind since the blizzard. "You don't seem as troubled as I expected," Daniel observed as they unsaddled their mounts. Sarah considered this, brushing Willow's coat with long, thoughtful strokes. "I should be frightened, shouldn't I? Facing exclusion from the community I've called home for years, risking an uncertain future with no guarantees of success." "Most would be," Daniel acknowledged. "Yet I feel..." Sarah searched for the right word. "Liberated. As if constraints I've accepted without question have suddenly been revealed as unnecessary." Daniel nodded slowly. "The buffalo." "Pardon?" Sarah looked at him questioningly. "The buffalo carcass," Daniel elaborated. "When survival required an unconventional solution, you discarded propriety without hesitation. Perhaps you've realized that your healing work requires similar freedom from artificial constraints." Sarah stared at him, struck by the insight. "Yes, exactly that. The blizzard forced me to recognize what truly matters. Life, compassion, practical action, and what doesn't, appearance, convention, others' approval. Such clarity often emerges from crisis," Daniel observed. "The question becomes whether we honor its lessons when normal conditions return." They finished tending the horses in companionable silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. As they walked back toward the store where Margaret could be seen, waiting in the doorway, Sarah found herself reluctant to end their conversation. "Will you return to the fort tomorrow?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "At first light, but I will bring Captain Williams your proposal for providing medical services. I believe he will respond favorably." "Thank you," Sarah said softly, aware that his advocacy would significantly improve her chances of establishing a viable circuit. "For everything, your support has made this possible." Daniel turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "You would have found your path regardless, Sarah Collins. Crisis simply revealed the strength and purpose that was always within you." The use of her full name, spoken with such quiet conviction, affected Sarah deeply. Before she could respond, Margaret called out a greeting, waving them inside with characteristic warmth. The moment passed, but its impact lingered as they entered the welcoming light of the Wilson home, where the evening would bring shared meals, practical discussions, and perhaps the first concrete steps toward a new chapter in Sarah's healing work. And though the future held many uncertainties, one thing had become clear: whatever path she chose would be defined by her own sense of purpose rather than Pine Creek's approval. That knowledge alone made the confrontation with Thomas Peterson not a defeat, but the catalyst for necessary change. Spring arrived with the gentle persistence that follows even the harshest winters. The snow retreated gradually, revealing muddy earth that promised eventual renewal. Sarah stood on the small porch of her cabin, watching the morning sun illuminate the distant hills with golden light. 3 months had passed since the blizzard that had altered the course of her life, and the changes were now taking tangible form. Beside her on the porch sat a large leather medical bag, newly crafted by Jacob Miller in exchange for Sarah's treatment of his youngest son's broken arm. The bag contained carefully organized compartments for herbs, tinctures, bandages, and instruments, designed specifically for travel between settlements. It represented not just practical necessity, but symbolic commitment to her new path. Today marked the official beginning of her healing circuit. After weeks of preparation, correspondence, and strategic visits, the route had been established. 5 settlements, including Pine Creek and 7 isolated homesteads, had agreed to her regular services. Among them, Fort Thompson had proven the most enthusiastic supporter, with Captain Williams arranging quarters for her monthly 3-day visits and offering military escort between certain remote locations when patrols aligned with her schedule. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Sarah's attention. Daniel appeared around the bend in the trail, his horse moving at an unhurried pace. Though she had been expecting him, the sight still brought warmth to her chest and a smile to her face. In the months since the blizzard, his visits to Pine Creek had become increasingly regular, ostensibly as part of his scouting duties, but with a pattern that seemed deliberately aligned with her presence. "Ready for departure?" he asked as he dismounted, his own smile subtle but genuine. Sarah nodded, gesturing to the packs arranged neatly beside her door. "Everything essential for a 3-week circuit, nothing extraneous. Rebecca would be proud of my efficiency." Daniel began securing her bags to Willow's saddle with practiced ease. They had fallen into comfortable routines during their recent journeys together. Sarah to outlying homesteads, establishing her circuit. Daniel on his expanded scouting routes that somehow frequently intersected with hers. "Pine Creek seems unusually active this morning," Daniel observed, nodding toward the settlement where numerous residents could be seen moving about despite the early hour. Sarah followed his gaze with a knowing expression. "Word of my departure has spread. Some come to wish me well, others to witness what they consider my exile." The response to Sarah's decision to establish a healing circuit had divided Pine Creek, as she had anticipated. Harold and Margaret Wilson had been steadfastly supportive, helping arrange connections with other settlements and spreading word of her expanded services. Jacob and Eleanor Miller had similarly championed her cause, with Eleanor organizing a group of women to prepare traveling supplies and preserve foods for Sarah's journeys. Thomas Peterson, predictably, had framed her decision as capitulation to the church council's authority rather than her own deliberate choice. His faction portrayed her departure as necessary moral correction rather than professional evolution. Reverend Caldwell, somewhat surprisingly, had adopted a more moderate position, publicly wishing her well while maintaining that her choices remained concerning for a Christian woman. "Your true patients understand," Daniel commented as he checked Willow's saddle girth. "Those who value judgment over healing were never your responsibility." Sarah smiled at his perception. Over their months of acquaintance, Daniel had demonstrated an uncanny ability to discern her thoughts, often articulating concerns or convictions she had barely acknowledged to herself. "The Kellers will be pleased to see you," she remarked, shifting focus to the day's journey. Their first destination was the now thriving Keller homestead, where Michael and Elizabeth had extended their cabin, expanded their livestock, and established connections with neighboring families. "William has been marking animal tracks, as I instructed," Daniel said, evident pride in his voice. His latest letter showed considerable improvement in identification skills. The correspondence between Daniel and young William had been unexpected but heartwarming. Detailed letters about wilderness survival, tracking, and native plant knowledge flowing regularly between the Cherokee scout and his eager student. Sarah's botanical journals and medical primers similarly traveled to William with detailed instructions for observation and practice, creating an unconventional but effective apprenticeship. As they made final preparations for departure, Sarah heard her name called from the direction of town. Eleanor Miller was hurrying toward them, a cloth-wrapped package in her hands. "I feared I'd miss you," she said breathlessly as she reached them. "One last contribution for your journey." She handed Sarah the package, which proved to contain freshly baked bread and a small jar of precious honey. "For strength and sweetness, along the way." Sarah embraced her friend warmly. "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything." Behind Eleanor came more figures from town. The Wilsons, the Johnsons, even reluctant Reverend Caldwell, maintaining a respectful distance from the others. Only Thomas Peterson and his most devoted followers were conspicuously absent. Harold stepped forward, offering his hand first to Sarah, then to Daniel. "The first circuit begins well, with clear skies and firm ground. A good omen, perhaps? Science, rather than omens, guides her path," Daniel remarked with subtle humor, "but favorable conditions are always welcome." The gathering had the feeling of a ceremony, though none had been officially planned. One by one, Pine Creek residents approached to offer small gifts, words of encouragement, or requests that Sarah check on distant relatives along her route. Even Reverend Caldwell eventually stepped forward. "Miss Collins," he said formally, "while the Church Council maintains its position regarding appropriate female conduct, I personally wish you safe travels. These are provided for your spiritual nourishment." He handed her a small leather-bound volume, selected Bible passages copied in his own meticulous handwriting. Sarah accepted the unexpected gift with appropriate gravity. "Thank you, Reverend. I'll carry them with me." Whatever their differences, she recognized the gesture as his attempt at reconciliation within the constraints of his position. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, Sarah found herself unexpectedly moved by the community's response. Pine Creek had never fully embraced her unconventional role, yet many had come to acknowledge its value and wish her well in her expanded mission. "Communities are seldom entirely of one mind," Daniel observed as they finally mounted their horses. "Even those that present united judgment often harbor diverse opinions beneath the surface." Sarah nodded, taking a last look at her cabin. Still her home, but now a way station rather than the center of her existence. "I've learned to value the genuine connections without requiring universal approval." They rode in companionable silence through Pine Creek, acknowledging final waves from residents returning to their daily activities. Once beyond the settlement's edge, Sarah felt the familiar sense of liberation that open spaces always provided, the frontier's gift of possibility, unbounded by artificial constraints. 3 weeks is a significant first circuit, Daniel remarked as they rode side by side along the widening trail. 7 homesteads, 5 settlements, and the fort, an ambitious beginning. With strategic rest periods built into the schedule, Sarah assured him, having carefully planned each segment of the journey. "And I'll adjust future circuits based on experience." Rebecca always said flexibility is as essential to frontier medicine as knowledge. Daniel nodded approvingly. Wisdom applicable beyond healing. The most successful scouts are those who adapt to changing conditions rather than forcing predetermined paths. The conversation flowed easily between them as the morning progressed, ranging from practical matters of the journey to philosophical reflections on their respective callings. By midday, they had covered considerable distance, the landscape gradually transitioning from the familiar territory surrounding Pine Creek to the more open plains near Spirit Ridge. As they paused to rest the horses and share a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit, Sarah found herself studying Daniel's profile against the vast sky. Something had been forming between them over these months, a connection deeper than friendship, but undefined by conventional terms. "You're contemplating something significant," Daniel observed without turning, aware of her gaze. Sarah smiled at his perception. "I've been considering what this circuit truly represents beyond the practical provision of medical care." "And what have you concluded?" he asked, finally turning to meet her eyes. "That like the buffalo carcass, it represents choosing life over convention," Sarah replied. "Not just for others through healing, but for myself through purpose aligned, with true values rather than external approval." Daniel nodded slowly, a powerful realization. "One you helped catalyze," Sarah acknowledged. "Your perspective has consistently challenged me to question boundaries I once accepted without examination." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken understanding. In the months since the blizzard, their relationship had evolved through shared experiences, meaningful conversations, and growing mutual respect. Yet neither had explicitly addressed the obvious question of what future they might share beyond professional collaboration. "Sarah," Daniel said finally, his voice carrying unusual gravity, "I've received new orders from Fort Thompson. Captain Williams has approved my request for a specialized role." Sarah turned to him with curious attention. "What role?" "Liaison between the fort and outlying settlements," Daniel explained, "focused on building sustainable connections with both settler communities and remaining indigenous groups in the territory. Less scouting, more diplomatic work." "That sounds perfectly suited to your abilities," Sarah observed, genuinely pleased for this recognition of his unique position bridging. "Multiple worlds," Daniel nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his expression. "The position includes establishing a base of operations separate from the fort, a location more central to the various communities requiring regular contact." Sarah's pulse quickened slightly as she began to understand the implications. "And have you selected this location?" "I've been considering a position approximately halfway between Pine Creek and Fort Thompson," Daniel replied, his eyes meeting hers with deliberate meaning. "Near the eastern edge of Spirit Ridge, where 3 established trails intersect." The location he described was familiar to Sarah. A beautiful area with a small, clear stream, sheltered by trees, yet with access to open ground. A natural crossroads that would indeed serve well as a central point for communications between scattered communities. It would also happen to be nearly precisely at the center point of your proposed circuit," Daniel added, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. The full significance of his words registered clearly. Daniel was proposing not just a practical base for his new duties, but a potential shared future, a place where their separate paths might converge while still allowing each to fulfill their distinct callings. "That seems geographically advantageous," Sarah replied carefully, her heart beating faster despite her measured tone. "I've secured permission to construct a cabin and outbuildings," Daniel continued, "designed with consideration for multiple possible uses, including a treatment room, for patients unable to travel to settlements." The thought had clearly been thoroughly developed, Not a hasty impulse, but a deliberately conceived possibility that respected both her independence and her healing work. Such a location would certainly reduce travel time between circuit segments, Sarah acknowledged, maintaining the pretense of practical discussion while emotions gathered beneath her calm exterior. Daniel's expression grew more serious. "Sarah, I'm not proposing this solely for practical advantage. I'm suggesting a shared future that honors both our separate purposes and our connection to each other." The directness of his statement broke through their cautious exchange. Sarah met his gaze, seeing in his eyes the same certainty she felt growing within herself. "We've never spoken of formal arrangements," she said softly. Words seemed unnecessary when actions revealed alignment. Daniel replied, "But if clarity is needed, I'm asking if you would consider joining our paths officially, not as Pine Creek or Fort Thompson might define such a union, but as we would define it, equal partners with shared values and separate gifts." The proposition hung in the air between them, profound in its simplicity, not a traditional proposal of marriage with its implications of female subordination, but an invitation to create something new, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. "I would consider that," Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "In fact, I believe I've been considering it for some time without acknowledging as much." Daniel's smile deepened, the reserve he typically maintained in settlements falling away in this private moment. "Then we'll build not just a cabin, but a new model, healer and liaison, creating a center for connection rather than isolation." "William will be delighted," Sarah observed with a sudden laugh, imagining the boy's excitement at having both his mentors in one location. "We'll need to include space for apprentices in these cabin plans." "Already incorporated," Daniel assured. His detailed preparation further evidence of the thought he had given this proposal, along with herb gardens, treatment areas, and meeting spaces for diplomatic gatherings. Sarah found herself deeply moved by his consideration. How thoroughly he had envisioned a future that accommodated her calling alongside his own. This was not a man asking her to abandon her purpose for his, but one offering to build something that enhanced both. "When would construction begin?" she asked, practical considerations naturally following emotional acceptance. "After the spring circuit," Daniel replied. "Captain Williams has authorized materials and some labor assistance. By autumn, the main cabin could be habitable." The timeline felt both distant and immediate, months away yet representing a definitive turning point in her life's direction. Sarah took a deep breath, allowing herself to fully embrace the possibility before them. "Then I accept," she said simply, "both your proposal of partnership and the practical arrangement it entails." Without witnesses or ceremony, their agreement felt nonetheless profound, a commitment forged through shared experience, rather than social convention. When Daniel reached for her hand, Sarah met him halfway, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of two people whose paths had converged through circumstance, but remained joined by choice. They continued their journey toward the Keller's homestead, conversation now flowing with renewed energy as they discussed practical details of their shared vision. The future that unfolded before them would undoubtedly hold challenges. Frontier life guaranteed as much, but Sarah felt a deep certainty that whatever came, they would face it with the same resourcefulness and courage that had allowed them to survive the blizzard and its aftermath. As Spirit Ridge appeared on the horizon, Sarah thought briefly of the buffalo carcass that had once sheltered 3 children from deadly cold, the desperate measure that had ultimately connected her to Daniel and catalyzed this new chapter. From crisis had come clarity, from necessity innovation, and from unlikely circumstances an unexpected path forward. We should reach the Kellers by evening, Daniel noted, guiding his horse around a muddy stretch of trail. The first official, stop on your healing circuit. And the first step toward our shared future, Sarah added, facing forward with renewed purpose as they rode side by side into the promise of spring. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.